deadly desert detour. We were all excited for our big adventure through the Arizona desert. I, Jake, along with my friends Sam, Lisa, and Mike, had been planning this trip for months. We wanted to explore some remote trails, far from the usual tourist paths, where we could experience the true solitude of the desert. We loaded the Jeep with supplies, tents, and, of course, our cameras to capture every epic moment. On the third day of our trip, the GPS suggested an alternative route, a detour that seemed to shorten our path to the next campsite. Sam, always the adventurer, insisted we take this new route. "It'll be faster, and we might see something new," he said. We were all in high spirits and agreed without hesitation. The road was smooth at first, a narrow strip of asphalt in the middle of a sea of sand and cacti. But soon, the asphalt disappeared, and the dirt road that replaced it was rough and increasingly isolated. Hours passed, and we began to feel like something was wrong. Lisa was the first to voice her concern. "Jake, do you think we're on the right track? There's nothing out here." I looked at the GPS, but it was losing signal intermittently. "It's probably just a rough patch. Let's go a little further, and if we don't find anything, we'll turn back," I replied, trying to stay optimistic. That's when the sandstorm started forming on the horizon. At first, it seemed like a distant gust, but within minutes, we were in the middle of a whirlwind of sand, with visibility reduced to almost nothing. The GPS finally lost signal completely, and our phones had no service. We were totally isolated. I stopped the Jeep, and we all got out, trying to figure out what to do next. Then, through the sand haze, we saw something ahead, a large, abandoned structure. It looked like some sort of old military complex, surrounded by rusted fences and faded warning signs. "Must be an old nuclear testing site or something," Mike said, trying to sound rational. "We could use it as shelter until the storm passes." Reluctantly, we agreed. The complex was even more eerie up close. The fences were in ruins, and the main gate was wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. The place looked like it had been abandoned for decades, but there was something that made me feel like we weren't alone. We entered the main building, a worn concrete structure with long, dark corridors. Lisa clung to my arm. "This doesn't feel right, Jake. We should have turned back." "We're here now, Lisa. Let's stick together and find a safe spot to wait it out," I replied, trying to hide my own growing fear. As we moved deeper into the building, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I started hearing noises, quick footsteps, indistinct whispers, but when I turned around, there was no one there. The others started noticing too. Mike suddenly stopped, pointing to a nearby room. "Did you guys hear that?" It sounded like a door slamming. "Let's check it out," Sam suggested, but his voice no longer held the same confidence. When we entered the room, we found remnants of old equipment and documents scattered across the floor. "This was some kind of lab," Lisa whispered, shining her flashlight over the dust-covered tables. "What were they doing here?" At the back of the room, I found a heavy door with rusty locks, leading to what seemed like a basement or bunker. A sense of dread washed over me, but I knew we had to explore. "Let's see what's down there," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The staircase was steep and creaked under our feet as we descended. The air down there was dense and cold, very different from the stifling desert heat outside. When we reached the bottom, Sam's flashlight illuminated something that made my stomach churn, dried blood stains on the floor, as if something or someone had been dragged away. What if someone's still here?" Lisa whispered, her voice breaking. "We need to get out of here now," I responded, panic starting to set in. As I turned to head back up, I heard a noise, a low, guttural moan coming from one of the adjacent rooms. Something was down there with us. Suddenly, the lights flickered and then went out completely, plunging us into total darkness. The sound of footsteps, now clearly audible, began to get closer. It wasn't just one person, it was several. We were surrounded. "Run!" I screamed, and we all bolted for the stairs, but not before hearing a horrifying scream of pain from behind us. Someone had been caught. I didn't look back. I raced up the stairs as fast as I could, my heart pounding. When we finally reached the surface, the sandstorm was raging stronger than ever, but nothing could stop me from reaching the Jeep. Sam, Lisa, and I managed to get into the car, but Mike wasn't with us anymore. I knew we couldn't go back, even if we wanted to. I started the engine, and we sped away from that cursed place and the storm that engulfed it. As we drove in silence, trying to distance ourselves from that nightmare, I realized that experience had changed everything. We were no longer the same, and the scars of that day would stay with us forever. Even now, sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those footsteps, feeling those invisible eyes watching, and wondering, what was really in that complex? And what happened to Mike? I don't know if I'll ever get answers, but one thing I know, I'll never blindly trust a GPS again, and I'll never take a detour without thinking twice. Mysterious disappearance in Costa Rica. I never imagined that a study trip could turn into a nightmare that would mark all of our lives. I was in the same class as Sarah and Emily, two of the most adventurous students I'd ever met. We were all part of an exchange program in Costa Rica, where we were exploring the country's biodiversity and natural wonders. Sarah and Emily were inseparable, always planning their next adventure. They weren't the type to shy away from risks. In fact, they loved discovering new places, even if it meant straying from the usual tourist trails. It was during a break from classes that they decided to explore a less-known trail in the mountains, near a remote village. I clearly remember when they invited me to join them. I declined because I was feeling a bit tired that day. Besides, the trail wasn't one recommended by the local guide, and I'd always been more cautious. They, however, were excited and undeterred by my concerns. "It'll be a unique experience," Sarah said, with that characteristic smile of hers. The next morning, they set out early, each carrying just a backpack with some snacks, water, and a camera. The plan was to explore the area, take some photos, and return before dark. The weather was good, and there was no indication that anything could go wrong. However, when night fell and they didn't return to the lodge, we started to worry. I tried not to panic, telling myself that maybe they just lost track of time, that they might have found something interesting and forgotten about the time. But when dawn came and there was still no sign of Sarah and Emily, worry turned into fear. The local authorities were alerted, and a search was initiated. We, the classmates, gathered together, trying to support each other while we waited for news. The hours passed slowly, each filled with growing anxiety. No one could understand how they, who were so careful, could have disappeared without a trace. After 2 days of searching, some of their belongings were found near a river. The discovery was both a relief and a new source of anguish. There was Emily's backpack, with some snacks still untouched, and Sarah's camera. But what disturbed us most were the photos the investigators found on the camera. The first ones were normal images of the two of them smiling, taking pictures of the lush landscape. But as the photos progressed, they became increasingly strange. Some of the photos showed the forest at night, as if someone had been taking pictures in the dark for no apparent reason. There were images of unidentifiable paths, and even of denser areas of the forest, where light barely penetrated. What shocked us most was a photo showing indistinct shadows that seemed to be moving among the trees. There was no way to know what they were, but something about those images conveyed a sense of unease I can't describe. The investigators tried to piece together the puzzle, but many questions remained unanswered. What led them to take those photos in the middle of the night? Why did they stray so far from the original trail? While local authorities suggested it might have been an accident, perhaps a fall or a detour that led them to get lost, nothing seemed to make sense. And, of course, the strange photos only added more mystery to the case. However, the intensive search eventually led to the conclusion that Sarah and Emily had gotten lost and succumbed to the elements, a theory that left all of us unsatisfied. The conditions in that part of the forest were challenging, with rugged terrain and treacherous rivers. It was possible that in trying to find their way back, they had wandered even further. But the truth is, no one really knew what happened during those final hours. Sarah and Emily's story quickly spread, and soon it became a topic of speculation in various circles. Some people suggested there might have been external interference, perhaps even a crime, but there was no concrete evidence to support that theory. Others, more inclined to mysticism, believed something supernatural might have been involved, pointing to the strange photos as proof. I never knew what to think of those theories. All I had was the feeling of loss and the void left by their absence. The impact of their disappearance was devastating for all of us. Sarah and Emily were not just our classmates but also our friends. Seeing their empty seats in class and knowing we would never hear their laughter again was hard to bear. We tried to move on with our lives, but nothing seemed the same. That trip, which was supposed to be one of the best times of our lives, became a constant reminder that nature, as beautiful as it is, can also be unforgiving and full of secrets. The return home was somber. The investigations were closed, and the case was officially declared an accident. But for me, and for many who were there, the doubts and mysteries never went away. Whenever I think of Sarah and Emily, I remember the adventures we had together and the enthusiasm they had for life. But I also remember the strange unease I felt when I saw those photos, a feeling that something much deeper and more disturbing had happened in those forests. To this day, I can't look at a trail in the forest without feeling a shiver down my spine. Sarah and Emily's story became a silent warning for me, a reminder that, no matter how much we plan and prepare, the unknown can always surprise us. And sometimes, as with my friends, it can take us to places from which we never return. the House of Fear. Since I was a kid, I've always been fascinated by motorcycles. Growing up in the small town of Denton, Texas, surrounded by open roads and the sound of bikes cutting through the wind, made that passion take root deep inside me. When I finally got a job as an apprentice at a motorcycle paint shop, I felt like I was on the right path to living my dream. The shop was in a more isolated area of town, and the roads to get there were full of curves and poorly marked. Even so, I enjoyed the freedom those routes provided. It was a summer afternoon, the suffocating heat made the hours drag on, and when the shift ended, all I wanted was to get home and rest. That night, however, I decided to take a different route. The sun was already setting when I realized I was lost. The roads all looked the same, and my cell phone had no signal. With my fuel running low, I knew I needed to ask for directions. That's when I spotted an old house by the side of the road. It looked abandoned, with peeling paint and broken windows, but faint lights flickered inside. There were no other houses nearby, and with exhaustion taking over me, I decided it was worth a try. I parked the bike, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. I knocked, but no one answered. The door was ajar, and a strange smell, a mix of dampness and something metallic, wafted out. I pushed the door open carefully and stepped inside, calling out to see if anyone was there. The house was oddly decorated. There were masks on the walls, grotesque sculptures, and what looked like animal bones scattered in the corners of the room. Every step I took made the floor creak, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating, and part of me wanted to run out of there, but the desire to find someone who could help me navigate the maze of roads was stronger. Suddenly, a man appeared in the doorway of a back room. He was tall, thin, and wore ragged, dirty clothes. His face was covered by a thick, unkempt beard, and his eyes had a gleam that made me shudder. He stared at me for a long moment before giving me a strange smile. "Lost?" he asked, in a rough, muffled voice. I nodded, trying to appear calm, but my heart was racing. The man, who introduced himself as Daryl, invited me to go further into the house, where he said he would show me the way back. Despite everything inside me screaming not to follow, I felt that refusing might be even more dangerous. The hallway he led me down was narrow, and the walls were covered with handprints and drawings that looked like they had been made with something other than paint. The strange smell intensified, and I began to feel a slight dizziness. We entered a room that looked like a long-abandoned banquet hall. There were more people there, all sitting around a table, murmuring to each other as if in a collective trance. The dim light came from worn-out candles, and the shadows they cast on the walls created distorted shapes. The whole place felt like something out of a nightmare, but what really disturbed me was what Daryl said next. He started talking about bodies in the basement and how the dirt he accumulated around the house gave him power. The way he spoke, as if revealing a dark secret, made my blood run cold. I pretended not to hear and just smiled nervously, saying that I really needed to get going. Daryl laughed, a dry, humorless sound, and told me that maybe it would have been better if I hadn't come in at all. Feeling like my situation was becoming increasingly dangerous, I quickly made up an excuse about someone waiting for me and began to back away slowly. The other people in the room continued murmuring, not even looking at me. I reached the front door and, without a second thought, ran to my motorcycle. My breathing was heavy, and my hands were trembling as I tried to start the engine. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I sped away as fast as I could. When I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw Daryl standing on the porch, watching me with that disturbing smile still on his face. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station back on the main road. My heart was still pounding, and all I wanted was to leave that place behind. I quickly asked the attendant for directions back and, without looking back, followed his instructions until I found a familiar road. Days later, still recovering from the shock, I heard about an investigation in the same area where I had gotten lost. The police had discovered that Daryl, the man I met that night, was involved in terrible crimes. He had been arrested and charged with multiple murders. I then found out that the house was notorious in the region, a place avoided by everyone except the curious who, like me, ended up approaching it without knowing the danger. The news left me in shock. I couldn't stop thinking about how close I had come to becoming another victim of that place. The idea that I had been in the presence of a killer, in such a sinister environment, haunted me constantly. For a while, I had recurring nightmares about Daryl and that house, the shadows on the walls, and the murmurs of the people around the table. Today, when I think back to that night, I feel a chill run down my spine. I don't know how I managed to get out of that situation, but I know luck was on my side. I learned the hard way to never underestimate the dangers that can hide in seemingly harmless places. Since then, I've become much more cautious, always thinking twice before trusting strangers or entering unfamiliar territories. This experience changed my life forever, teaching me that evil can lurk in the most unexpected places. And sometimes, curiosity can truly put our lives at risk. If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us, we'd love to hear it. Now, let's dive into the next story. Deadly encounter in Montana. The road seemed endless. I had planned a simple trip, something straightforward, a quick visit to a client in a small town in Montana, then head back home the same day. But things started to go wrong when my GPS stopped working. There was no cell signal in that remote area, and before I knew it, I was completely lost on a deserted road, surrounded only by fields and forests. The sun was setting, and anxiety began to creep in. The road, which initially seemed just empty, now started to feel threatening. The few houses I passed were far apart, their porch lights already on, but there was no sign of life, no one around to ask for directions. I knew that continuing to drive without knowing where I was going would only take me further away from any help. Finally, I spotted a small farm in the distance and decided to stop and ask for directions. The fence was old and worn, and the house looked deserted, but there were a few cars parked beside the barn. I thought I might find someone inside, so I parked the car and approached the building. The sound of crickets in the growing night was the only thing breaking the silence, and as I got closer, I started to feel a tension in the air, something I couldn't explain. As I approached, I heard low, rough voices coming from inside the barn. My instinct told me to turn back, but I was already there, and I needed directions. I knocked on the large barn door, trying to appear as friendly as possible. The voices stopped abruptly, and within seconds, the door creaked open slowly. What I saw on the other side made me freeze. Inside the barn was a group of men, all with stern expressions. But what caught my attention the most was that many of them were armed. One of them, a large man with a cold look, approached and asked what I was doing there. I stammered, trying to explain that I was lost and just wanted to know how to get back to the main road. But the moment I mentioned that, the atmosphere changed drastically. The men exchanged quick, suspicious glances. The man who had questioned me took a step closer, his face now just inches from mine. "Are you a cop?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. I tried to laugh, to explain that no, I was just a salesman, but my attempt to sound casual came off forced, even to me. They weren't convinced. Suddenly, two of the men grabbed my arms and shoved me inside the barn. The already threatening environment became suffocating. They threw me against an old chair and started questioning me, their questions becoming more aggressive. They wanted to know who I was, why I was there, and how I ended up at that place. My heart was pounding so hard that I could barely think. They were convinced I was a threat, a spy, or worse, an undercover cop. One of the men, with a scar running down the side of his face, pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at me. Fear took hold of me, and for a moment, I was sure that this was the end. I tried to argue, to explain that it was all a terrible misunderstanding, but they didn't want to listen. They were convinced I knew too much. Then the leader, the man who had first questioned me, signaled for the others to release me. I felt a brief moment of relief, quickly replaced by terror when he ordered them to take me outside the barn. I was dragged out to the field, where the darkness was almost complete, except for the starlight above us. They threw me to the ground, and I saw one of them approach with the gun still in hand. My whole body was shaking. He knelt beside me and whispered, "You shouldn't have come here." I heard the sound of the trigger being pulled and closed my eyes, expecting the worst. But instead of a gunshot, I heard a dry click. I opened my eyes slowly and realized the gun wasn't loaded. They were playing with me, testing my nerves, enjoying my terror. The relief was brief because they soon made me get up and pushed me back toward the barn. Inside the barn, the leader looked at me for a long moment before finally saying, "You're leaving now, but if you say anything about this, we will find you." They let me go, but the fear and the threat in their words followed me out. I ran to my car and got out of there as fast as I could, my heart still pounding. When I finally got back to the main road, my body was exhausted, but my mind was on high alert. I got home in the early hours of the morning and woke up my wife, still in shock. I told her what had happened, and together, we decided we couldn't stay in that area any longer. The fear that those men would come after us was paralyzing. The next day, we started making plans to move. The thought that those men were still out there, that they could come after us at any moment, was unbearable. Within a few weeks, we were in a new city, far from that place, trying to rebuild our lives. Fatal accident on a one-way street. That night, I was absolutely exhausted. It had been a long and stressful day at work, and all I wanted was to get home and rest. But the traffic was chaotic, worsening my fatigue. I drove slowly, trying to stay focused, but I knew the exhaustion was getting to me. It was late, and the streets were dark and almost deserted. As I entered an unfamiliar neighborhood, I realized I had lost my usual route. The GPS in my car was malfunctioning, and as I tried to find my way, I made a right turn. I barely noticed that I had entered a one-way street going the wrong way. The fatigue had clouded my judgment, and everything happened too fast for me to react. As I drove down the street, I felt a sudden chill. I looked in the rearview mirror but saw nothing. My eyes were heavy, and I was struggling to keep them open. Then it happened. Just as I turned to the side, a young man on a motorcycle appeared in my field of vision, coming from the opposite direction, too fast for me to avoid. It all seemed to happen in slow motion. The young man, without a helmet, tried to swerve, but the space was too tight. The sound of the impact was terrible. I felt the car shake, and I saw the motorcyclist being thrown to the side of the road. The horror of what had just happened hit me like a punch. My heart raced, and for a second, I couldn't move a muscle. I hurried out of the car, fear and guilt already overwhelming me. I ran to the young man, who was lying on the sidewalk, motionless. My hands trembled as I tried to see if he was okay, but there was no response. I tried to call emergency services as quickly as I could, my mind spinning in a whirlwind of emotions. Time seemed to have stopped as I waited for help. The ambulance arrived within minutes, but to me, those minutes felt like an eternity. I watched, helpless, as the paramedics tried to revive the young man. Every second that passed without a sign of life was like a blow to my heart. The flashing lights of the ambulance cast grotesque shadows on the street, and all I could think was that this couldn't be happening. The paramedics did everything they could, but deep down, I knew. When they informed me that the young man had passed away, a wave of despair washed over me. I could barely believe it. The guilt crushed me, even knowing there was no intent to cause the accident. Feeling responsible for a lost life is an unbearable burden, and at that moment, I couldn't see beyond the darkness of guilt. The police arrived soon after, and I was questioned about what had happened. I told them about my fatigue, about the mistake I made in entering the one-way street. They were understanding and professional, but I knew that nothing they said could ease the pain I felt. The weight of that accident was something I would have to carry forever. After hours of procedures, I was released to go home. I drove slowly, still in shock. When I finally got home, I couldn't sleep. I stayed up all night, reliving the moment of impact, the feeling of helplessness, and the sight of the young man lying on the street. I knew the guilt wouldn't leave me anytime soon. In the days that followed, the weight of the accident consumed me. Even after being legally exonerated, the sense of responsibility didn't leave me. I often found myself thinking about the young man, about his life cut short so brutally. I began avoiding driving, afraid that something similar might happen again. My confidence had been shattered, and I felt vulnerable and lost. I tried seeking help, talking to friends and family, but no one seemed to fully understand what I was feeling. To them, it was an accident, something that could happen to anyone. But for me, it was a personal tragedy, something that had changed my life forever. I began isolating myself, avoiding places and situations that might remind me of what had happened. Over time, I realized I needed to find a way to cope with it. I started attending a support group for people who had gone through similar experiences. Hearing other stories, sharing my own, was the first step in beginning to heal the wounds that the accident had left. I still feel the weight of what happened, but now I know I'm not alone. Each day is a challenge, but I'm learning to live with what happened. The tragedy of that night taught me a lot about the fragility of life and the importance of being mindful every moment. I will never forget the young motorcyclist, but I'm trying to honor his memory by living more consciously, more carefully, and more gratefully for the time we have. This is the story of how a simple mistake, made in a moment of fatigue, can change lives forever. A story that serves as a reminder that life is precious and that we must treat it with the utmost care. Today, I continue to struggle to find peace with what happened, knowing it will never be easy, but also knowing that, somehow, I need to move forward. Whispering Hollow Road. I've always enjoyed a good challenge, so when my friends dared me to drive alone down the infamous road known as Whispering Hollow Road, I accepted without a second thought. They laughed, calling me either brave or crazy, depending on their perspective. But to me, it was just another adventure, a way to prove that I wasn't afraid of those old, creepy stories everyone loved to tell. It was a moonless night when I finally decided to face the road. The sky was covered with dark clouds, and the only light came from the dim headlights of my car. The silence around me was almost tangible, as if the world had paused to watch my small act of bravery, or foolishness, depending on who was watching. Whispering Hollow Road was known for being desolate, winding, and shrouded in mystery, but I was determined to make it through. As I drove, the environment around me began to change. The trees lining the road seemed to lean inward, as if trying to swallow me. The wind, once a gentle breeze, began to whisper through the branches, creating sounds that sent chills down my spine. It was as if the road was alive, trying to tell me something, but I refused to listen. I pressed on, more determined than ever to reach the other side. The stories I'd heard about Whispering Hollow Road started to resurface in my mind. They said that travelers who ventured there on moonless nights never returned. There were rumors of apparitions, disembodied voices, and a ghostly hitchhiker who appeared to those foolish enough to drive there alone. I remembered this, and for a brief moment, a sense of unease began to creep in, but I quickly pushed it away. Suddenly, the car radio, which had been off, began to emit a low, disturbing static. At first, I thought it was just interference, but soon the static was replaced by a distorted, incomprehensible voice. The voice seemed distant, as if coming from another world, and its tone was cold and lifeless. My heart began to race, but I forced myself to keep going. I wasn't about to let a silly superstition scare me. The road seemed endless, and the feeling of isolation intensified with every mile. I started to wonder if I'd made the right decision, but turning back wasn't an option. Then, I saw something ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road. I squinted to see better, and when I finally made out what it was, I felt my stomach turn. It was a young woman, with wet hair hanging over her face, her empty eyes fixed on me. I knew, deep down, that this figure shouldn't be there. It was the ghostly hitchhiker everyone talked about, the same one so many people swore they'd seen before disappearing forever. My instinct told me not to stop, to keep driving, but something in me, maybe curiosity, made me slow down. I rolled down the window and, with a trembling voice, asked if she was okay. The girl didn't respond, just stood there, motionless, her empty eyes locked onto mine. I felt panic rising inside me, and in that moment, I knew I'd made a huge mistake. I tried to speed up, but the car wouldn't respond. The engine seemed to have died, and the static on the radio grew louder, more deafening. The figure began to move slowly toward the car, and terror paralyzed me. I was trapped, unable to leave or do anything. The girl got closer, and I could feel the temperature drop drastically. Her empty gaze seemed to pierce my soul, and the radio, now completely out of control, emitted a cacophony of voices and screams. I felt tears streaming down my face as I desperately tried to get the car to start again. But my attempt was futile. The girl was now next to the window, her pale, wet face just inches from mine. She didn't say a word, but the message was clear: I should never have come. Fear consumed me, and all I could do was close my eyes and pray that this was just a nightmare. When I opened my eyes again, the girl was gone. The car mysteriously started without me doing anything. The road was empty, and the silence had returned. I took a deep breath, still shaking, and sped away as fast as I could. But no matter how far I drove, the road seemed to stretch on infinitely, with no end in sight. After a while, my memory starts to fail. I don't remember how or when I got off Whispering Hollow Road, but somehow, I made it back home. The details of that night became hazy, as if my brain was trying to erase what happened. The car, however, never worked again, as if something in it had been broken forever. My friends never believed me when I told them what happened. To them, it was just another scary story to tell around the campfire. But I know what I saw, and I know what I felt on that road. Since then, I've never driven alone at night, and Whispering Hollow Road is a place I never mention, not in conversation, not even in thought. What happened to me that night remains a mystery, something I try to forget but that continues to haunt my dreams. The road, the girl, the radio, it all feels like a distant blur, but the fear, that's real, and it lives inside me, a constant reminder that there are things in this world we should never challenge. Unexpected hunt in Wales. My adventure began like many others I had experienced. My friend Tom and I were on a long-distance hike through the rolling hills of Wales. The breathtaking landscapes and fresh air were exactly what we needed to disconnect from our hectic lives. We had planned this trip for months, studying maps and choosing the best trails. But, as with any great adventure, the unexpected always seems to find a way to insert itself. On the afternoon of the third day of our hike, we realized we were drifting away from our planned route. The sun was beginning to set, and the shadows of the hills stretched out, leaving us with a sense of urgency. We didn't want to spend the night not knowing where we were. That's when we spotted a farmer on a nearby property. He seemed friendly, and we decided to ask for directions. The farmer, an old man with a thick accent and a yellowed smile, told us he knew a shortcut that would lead us back to the main trail. We thanked him and followed his directions, which seemed simple enough: cross a field, follow a stone fence, and keep going until we found the road. However, as we walked, the instructions began to feel confusing, and we soon realized we weren't where we were supposed to be. The terrain around us started to change. The green hills gave way to a dense and somewhat oppressive forest. The trees closed in around us, and the silence was unsettling. We no longer heard the sound of birds or the wind in the leaves, just the rustling of our own footsteps. We were lost, that was certain, and darkness was quickly approaching. As we tried to find our way back, we stumbled upon something unexpected: a majestic deer, with brown fur and imposing antlers. The animal stood in a clearing, as if it had appeared out of nowhere. We were awestruck by its beauty and decided to take a photo to capture the moment. But before we could reach for our cameras, the unexpected happened. A deafening sound cut through the air, and in an instant, the deer fell to the ground. Tom and I froze, not understanding what had just happened. That's when we realized it wasn't a natural accident. The deer had been shot, and the silence that followed the shot was as heavy as the air around us. Shock quickly turned to fear when two men emerged from the trees, both carrying rifles. They were dressed in expensive hunting clothes, and one of them, with a surprised expression, apologized for what had happened. They said they were out hunting and that the deer had been hit by mistake while they were aiming at another target. The tension was palpable, but they seemed genuinely sorry. One of them, who introduced himself as Lord Markham, explained that they were part of an old local family that had owned the land for generations. He assured us we had nothing to fear, but the atmosphere remained uncomfortable. We were on private property, in a situation we weren't prepared for. The hunters, trying to make up for the mistake, offered to take us back to the nearest village. Reluctant but without other options, we accepted. The walk back was tense, but they made an effort to keep the conversation light, telling stories about the region and how hunting was a family tradition. Even so, the earlier incident hung in the air, casting a shadow over the conversation. When we reached the village, the hunters insisted on helping us further. They bought us supplies and made sure we were ready to continue our hike the next day. Their kindness seemed genuine, but the discomfort from the event still lingered. We said goodbye to them with a mix of relief and distrust. Back at the campsite, we tried to process what had happened. The wild beauty of the deer and the brutal impact of its death were etched in our minds. Tom suggested that we might want to cut the trip short, but I insisted we continue. We were there to explore and have an adventure, and despite the disturbing incident, I didn't want it to ruin the experience. In the days that followed, we continued our journey, but the feeling of unease never fully left us. Every distant gunshot made my heart race, and I found myself looking over my shoulder, as if expecting something else to happen. The forest, those hills, no longer felt as welcoming as they had before. At the end of the trip, as we headed home, we reflected on everything that had happened. The experience had been much more intense than we'd anticipated, and the encounter with the hunters was something that would stay with us for a long time. I knew that, despite everything, this story would be one we'd tell our friends around the campfire, but with a much more serious tone than we'd originally planned. Even today, I think about that deer and the strange combination of beauty and violence we witnessed in that clearing. The wilderness has its own way of reminding us of our vulnerability, and that reminder is something I carry with me. I've learned that, even in the best planned adventures, the unexpected can always happen, and sometimes, it's better to stick to the known path. Bear attack in Alaska. That trip to Alaska was supposed to be an unforgettable adventure, and it turned out to be just that, but in a way I could never have imagined. My friend Lucas and I had been planning this hunting trip for months. It was an opportunity to explore the wilderness, test our skills, and above all, enjoy each other's company in a completely different environment from what we were used to. On the second day, we decided to venture deeper into the forest. The air was crisp, and there was a serenity in the atmosphere that was almost spiritual. The sound of leaves under our feet and the distant call of birds were the only things breaking the absolute silence. We were cautious, respecting the nature around us, aware that we were in wild territory, where man is just another visitor. Our goal was to hunt elk, but we knew that in those lands, other, much more dangerous animals also roamed. The possibility of encountering a grizzly bear was always in our minds, but until that moment, it had been more of a distant concern than a real threat. We walked for hours until we finally found signs of life, fresh tracks on the ground, indicative of a large animal. We followed the tracks, with Lucas leading the way. I kept a safe distance, carefully observing the surroundings. Then everything changed. Without any warning, what had seemed like a peaceful hunting day turned into a nightmare. We heard a low, guttural growl to our left, and before we could react, a massive grizzly bear emerged from the vegetation, its fierce eyes locked on us. Time seemed to slow down. Lucas, who was further ahead, was the first to realize the imminent danger. He tried to back away, but the bear was faster. With impressive speed, the creature charged at him. The sound of the bear roaring was deafening, and for a moment, I was gripped by paralyzing fear. But the need to protect my friend overpowered any hesitation. I grabbed my gun, my mind racing, trying to remember everything we knew about how to handle a situation like this. The bear was on top of Lucas, who was struggling to defend himself, but the animal's strength was overwhelming. I knew I had to act fast. I tried to stay calm and act with precision, knowing that every second counted. I fired once, and the sound of the shot echoed through the forest. The bear recoiled but didn't back down. It was furious, more aggressive than before. Lucas was screaming for help, and I knew I couldn't fail. Keeping my focus, I continued trying to scare the animal away, until finally, after an intense effort, I managed to make the bear retreat. After what seemed like an eternity, the bear finally backed off, and the situation began to calm down. The silence that followed was overwhelming, almost unreal. I stood there, staring at the scene before me, unsure if what had happened was real or a nightmare I would soon wake up from. Lucas was injured but alive. I ran to him, adrenaline still pumping through my veins, and helped him up. He was pale, and his eyes reflected a mix of shock and relief. We managed to get away from the area, and it was only then that the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. We had faced one of nature's most fearsome creatures and survived, but the impact of that encounter was something I wasn't prepared to deal with. We spent the rest of the day trying to process what had happened. Lucas was in shock, but his injuries weren't severe, something for which I was immensely grateful. We decided that the best thing to do was return to camp and rest. The adrenaline was wearing off, and in its place came an exhaustion that seemed to drain all my energy. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the events of the day finally began to weigh on me. The memory of the bear and the intensity of the situation were still present, spinning in my mind, unable to be forgotten. Lucas, who was usually the more talkative of us, was unusually quiet. He was also processing what had happened, and the reality that he might not have been there, talking to me, was something neither of us could ignore. I tried to sleep, but the images of the struggle kept me awake. It wasn't just the fear of facing such a powerful animal, but also the seriousness of what we had witnessed. I knew that in that situation, there was no other choice but to act to protect us, but the weight of responsibility was something I couldn't shake. The next morning, we decided to end the hunt and head home. The idea of continuing, of facing the dangers of the forest again, was something neither of us was willing to do anytime soon. As we packed up camp, the forest around us seemed different, less welcoming, more somber. We were ready to leave, but the experience of that fight would leave a permanent mark. Back in civilization, we tried to return to our lives, but the incident in Alaska continued to haunt us. I couldn't forget the bear's gaze, the responsibility I felt at that moment. It was something I had never experienced before, and it changed me. I came to see nature in a different way, with an even greater respect for its power and unpredictability. Today, when I remember that trip, I feel a mix of emotions. There's pride in having survived, but there's also deep reflection on what we had to do. Alaska, with all its wild beauty, taught me that life in the wilderness is as much about majesty as it is about the seriousness of the situations we may face. And that's a lesson I will never forget, something I carry with me every day. If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out True Scary Stories for sleep with rain sounds. Fall asleep quickly by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.